the facts really matter, right? And that it's good right now. I bet a lot of Republicans would say they support what the Trump administration is doing if Iran, fires back, if a lot of American servicemen are killed, if American interests in the region are at risk, if sleeper cells activate in America. If the war goes badly, if there is a war, if the war goes badly, that's going to change how public opinion goes.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Power and Flower. I am Seth Maskett.
And I'm John Hagner.
We are a political scientist and a political consultant who are trying to understand and explain what is going on in U.S. politics. We also care deeply about pastries. And as a brief diversion, I have something very excited planned for now. I have timed some rosemary bread in the oven that is actually coming ready right now. And I'm going to pull it out of the oven as part of the beginning of our show. So let's see how it came out.
I'm really sorry that podcasts are not a medium with an aroma, because that's the best part of a rosemary bread.
Oh, man, it smells so good. Okay, yeah, so I have to take my word for it. But,
It's gorgeous.
It looks pretty good.
Oh, I like your silicone baking thing too.
Yeah, this is kind of how's it pronounced? LaCroix is the company. I'll post a link to it. But basically, it's a combination mixing bowl and proofing basket and quasi-Dutch oven at the same time. It does everything. It does a pretty nice job. Yeah. Okay. Well, that out of the way, we can now move on to the issue at hand. So, I'm walking through the house. We are recording this on a blazingly hot Tuesday morning across much of the country, June 24th. And we're going to be talking about what is going on between the U.S. and Iran and Israel, and what kind of effect that will have in the U.S., on U.S. politics, on U.S. public opinion. So we may or may not be at war with Iran when you get this message, when you hear this podcast. Iran may or may not be at war with Israel when you hear this. Just to recap what briefly happened over the last few days. On last Friday, Donald Trump said he was giving Iran 14 days to give up its nuclear program or face a bombing campaign by the U.S. military. The next day, Saturday, Trump authorized a bombing campaign on 3 Iranian nuclear reactors. On Sunday, the Secretary of State, the Vice President, and others went on TV to reassure the world that the U.S. was not at war with Iran, but just needed to take out their nuclear reactors so they can't build a nuclear bomb. Later on Sunday, Trump tweeted that actually we are at war with Iran and we want regime change. Then yesterday, Monday, he suddenly announced that the war was over. God bless Israel. God bless Iran. And earlier this morning on Tuesday, he was cussing out Israel for violating the ceasefire that we're not even sure Israel or Iran had agreed to. By the time you hear this, I have no idea what the situation was going to be. But what some people have picked up on, and pretty obviously, there are some important similarities and dissimilarities between this and the invasion of Iraq that George W. Bush organized in 2003. One of the notable differences, at least so far, is how profoundly unpopular a war with Iran is today across the ideological spectrum. There really hasn't been much of an attempt to sell this to the American public, to the Congress, or really anyone until the attacks had already happened. And the rationale for these attacks has really been shifting by the minute. So this gives us a chance to talk about something we do know something about, which is public opinion and war. Again, this thing may be over now. It may drag on for years. We really have no idea. But it is going to affect how people think about the second Trump administration and how people around the world think about the United States. So we're going to talk about this. John, I have a bunch of questions for you. But first of all, congratulations on your recent wedding.
Thank you. It was very exciting. We missed a couple episodes of podcasting, but it feels like that's worth it for matrimonial bliss.
Yes. It's a worthy sacrifice. Next question. So I don't even know. Where do we begin on this? Let's just go with, what is your read on current public opinion on the possibility of war with Iran, on this military strike? What do we know about where the public is and what they'll support in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, and I think you started this episode off in absolutely the right way. Like, this is a really fluid system. We don't really know what's happening. I think public opinion is changing by the minute, and if you were in the field right now surveying this, you'd probably see different results sort of night to night. So, I. I think it's worth stepping back and taking a big picture. I think that there are several contradictory strands of American public opinion at play here. I think the first is a general, that's not our problem, anti-interventionism, which has been true of Americans for a really long time. I think that has been sharpened in the last 20 years by a specific anti-Middle Eastern war. The Iraq War started off very popular, got very unpopular as it went poorly. And the Afghanistan war was very unpopular, but so was ending it, which is a contradiction that I think is going to make it hard for future presidents to understand where the public is. So there's definitely a sense, particularly a lot of people who voted for Trump feel deeply that American involvement in wars in the Middle East is a bad idea. At the same time, there's also a very strong strand of pro-Israel public opinion in America that is
Mhm.
rooted in, obviously, in Jewish voters, but also in evangelical voters, where there's almost a philo-Semitism, which I think, when you dig in on why it's there, is often about ending the world, and there's some disturbing parts of that for sure. But American public opinion is very strongly pro-Israel. We're starting to see that change a bit in the wake of the Gaza incursion, but still overall, most American voters will say that Israel is a very important ally that we need to support. So that's there. There's also, a longstanding strain of support for the military once an involvement happens. So, making it, I think a lot of people whose experience was shaped by Vietnam and by the, what felt like anti-military tendencies, that even people who disagree with the policy behind the war, in the time when American pilots are flying over Iran, want to feel supportive of that and want to sound supportive of that I think complicates things. And then finally, nothing is better for cable news ratings than wars. Across the ideological spectrum on the news media, over the last week since the bombs were dropped, it has been strongly in favor of this, right? That CNN is reporting this like it is the best idea that's ever happened, even in a network that doesn't usually take the Trump administration side of things, because war is great for ratings. There is a sort of deep reflexive support for military interventionism in the media environment. So I think all of those things are
Wow.
combining to
Mhm.
leave kind of a muddled picture here, where, in the polls taken about whether you wanted to go to war with Iran before the bombing started, Republicans were very strongly saying that they did not. But I think if you redid those polls right now and said you support what the Trump administration is doing in Iran, you would see a very strong number of Republicans saying that they do. And I think all of this comes, and this is a theme we've talked about on the show a few times, and we'll talk about for as many episodes as we make. But the kind of schoolhouse rock view of politics is, you have a position on an issue and then you go figure out which political party or candidate agrees with you on that issue and then you vote for them. That is not the way that the world works. The way the world works is you decide which team you're on, and then the positions that team holds are the positions that you share. That is much more common in the way that political persuasion and political identity works than the other way around. That for the most part, people's
Mhm.
issue positions are downhill from their partisanship and from their team. And so as the facts change, as the as the issue positionings change, so can their support for it. But I think the other thing that we've talked about a lot on this podcast, and we'll continue to, is that the facts really matter, right? And that it's good right now. I bet a lot of Republicans would say they support what the Trump administration is doing if Iran, fires back, if a lot of American servicemen are killed, if
Mhm.
American interests in the region are at risk, if sleeper cells activate in America. If the war goes badly, if there is a war, if the war goes badly, that's going to change how public opinion goes. So these aren't just questions of messaging; they're also questions of, is it working? And you could see a world where, there is a ceasefire, that Iran does not do more than they did, which so far yesterday they shot a few missiles at an American airbase, but they had told, or in Qatar, but they told the Qataris ahead of time what and when and where those missiles would be aimed. So it really limited damage. So if
Mm-hmm.
that's the full Iranian response, I think a lot of people are going to look at this as a very successful thing from the Trump administration. And you may see some independents and even Democrats giving him credit for it. So I do think the facts are really going to matter to where public opinion lands.
Wow. I've been surprised. I've only just followed a little bit of the polling over the last few days, but some of these numbers seem to be really all over the place. There was some poll that had support for the strikes in Iran at, like, down in literally the single digits, and that was true for
Yeah.
Democrats and Republicans. But then today I'm seeing some polls saying it's more like 40% support, 60% oppose, more Republicans supporting. The numbers move around a lot, and I'm assuming this is an area where people don't necessarily have a lot of facts yet. They're open to what they're told. They're open to question wording issues.
Mhm.
And there might be a difference between how people initially hear the words bombing Iran and then how they react to members of Congress who they trust, Fox News personalities who they trust, describing what's going on, and then they might move around relative to that. So
For sure.
it's
And also
early.
the same
Yeah.
same confusion you and I have voters are having, right? Like, are we talking about, is this the redo of the Iraq War where American soldiers are going to be there getting killed, and where, an occupation force that cost trillions of dollars is expected to, prop up a puppet regime of the West in Iran? Or is this three planes left Missouri, dropped a bunch of bombs, flew home, and that's the end of it, right? Like,
Mm,
those are going to have really different levels of support because they're incredibly different. I do think that, like, we saw Trump this weekend float the idea of regime change. I think that is from a public opinion perspective, a very dangerous place for anyone to try to go. That I don't think that there's going to be the appetite among any Americans of any political party to support an Iraq style or even an Afghanistan style regime change and then rebuilding. I think
mm,
it's going to take another generation of voters before people are willing uh, to invest that amount of blood and treasure in that region of the world.
mm,
But if it is limited to three bombers went and supported the Israeli government in damaging the military, and if it turns out that the nuclear program has been delayed, which again we do not know at this point, um, maybe the voters are right to say that they're supported. It's really it feel the term the fog of war is applied to much more serious things than this, but it is
mm.
also very foggy from a public opinion perspective.
So there's a sense out there, I think it's an inaccurate one, but that Trump largely doesn't care about public opinion. He just does what he wants to do, and he's not worried about being punished. I think that's inaccurate. I think he actually does react to public opinion. I think that's why he soft pedaled his abortion stances last year during the campaign. It's why he holds big military parades and why he gets upset when they're not popular. Um, I'm wondering, do God knows what's going on in his head, but is it possible that Trump actually backed off on this war and decided to declare peace recently, precisely because he saw that the public was not with him? Do we think that's a responsiveness here?
Yeah, I think completely. I agree with you, though. I think Trump cares about public opinion. I think that what Trump doesn't care about is the Republican Party necessarily. I think Trump cares
Mm,
about Trump, and he cares
right.
about Republicans to the extent that they reflect him. I don't think he's worrying about the Republicans 20 or 30 years from now. Um, so I think his approach to public opinion might be different than other presidents, but I do absolutely agree he cares about it. He also seems to recently have seized on this idea that he deserves a Nobel Peace Prize. He has been talking about that a lot, and it's the kind of thing that you're like, oh, you're a billionaire who's the most powerful person in the world. Surely that's enough. Like one of the things about Trump is that he is the most desperately and transparently needy person on the face of the planet, maybe who's
Yes.
ever been born.
Yes. Two
And
two
so
terms of the U.S. presidency is not enough.
is not
Is
enough
wow.
because
Yeah.
he needs universal acclaim.
Yes.
And so yeah, I wonder if some of this is also him auditioning for the Nobel Peace Prize people. And if that actually is impacting what he's doing. Some of the reporting from the New York Times said that part of why he agreed to do this is because he saw how well the Israeli attacks were playing on Fox News, and he wanted some credit. So I
Mm.
think that the flip side of him knowing that the public doesn't want a long protracted war with Iran is also that he saw that, at least in the sort of ways that world policy is reflected by cable news ratings, that what Israel was doing was playing well with people that he cares about, and that he wanted to be associated with it. So, I think
Mm.
he may be trying to thread the public opinion needle there. From your perspective, what do you think is driving this? Is there anything in the political science literature, or is there anything in the tools that you have access to, and the information so well? Like, I know you've done a lot of research on local Republican Party folks. How do you think this is playing with them?
That's an excellent question. And I have not checked in with them while, just in the last few days on this issue. My guess is, and we've seen this from a few, more like traditionally conservative party officials and elected officials. There's some discomfort with this, in the sense that, like, they don't like the idea of prolonged military engagements. They don't like the idea of the U.S. getting tied into another Middle East campaign. We saw a very interesting thing. Congressman Tom Massey is, very staunch conservative Republican, has been a real ally of Donald Trump's. He came out and said the other day that the bombing of Iran was unconstitutional, and now, of course, Trump has declared him an enemy and has announced the beginning of a super PAC to try and get this guy kicked out in next year's primaries. We just see, like, this is why Republican uh, public officials stand with Trump so much, because, like, if you push him too far, he'll go after your seat. And
Yeah.
so, that's certainly part of what's going on here. Sorry, I interrupted you.
And I think Massey is an idiosyncratic Republican, because I actually do
Mhm.
think, we were saying a lot of people pick their team and then decide their issue afterward. I think he's one of the exceptions, that he genuinely
Okay.
believes the stuff he's been saying, and has been Trump has gone after him before, and this isn't the first time Trump tried to beat him in a primary, because in the first administration he was often inconvenient. He voted no on the big beautiful bill. Yeah, he does stand up for what he believes in. He's not somebody I would vote for, but you kind of respect the throwback nature of it. But he, I think, feels emboldened to take these stances now, because Trump has taken a swing at him before and missed.
Mm.
And we'll see. That magic may not keep working, but for now, he has survived what they threw at him already, and is still standing.
Um, yeah, and also, like, to your question, like, where where does this come from? This is, I think, a pattern that we've seen with Trump in a number of other areas, in that he doesn't always see the political subtext, or he doesn't always see, what people talk about versus what they actually do. Um, we see this with, like, Republicans have been demonizing universities and colleges for decades, for maybe even centuries. And that's just usually a convenient kick dog. They like to complain about it. No one ever actually does anything about it, until Trump comes along and is basically at war with higher education across the country. He doesn't see it as a symbolic thing. He actually wants to do this. I think similarly here, there were, as I recall, 20 odd years ago, there were people within the Bush administration who wanted to do a lot more than simply invade and occupy Iraq. There was some, there was a group of people sort of in Dick Cheney's circle that called themselves the Vulcans. And I think their slogan was like, amateurs go into Baghdad, real men go into Tehran. And they were pushing for, like, regime change in Iran back then. Um,
Yeah.
and
Do
and
you remember
like
the video of John McCain singing the "Bomb Bomb 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 Iran"
Yeah,
song?
that wasn't
Yeah,
great.
it
Yeah,
wasn't a great
and
moment.
and even within, the very popular Bush administration that was given to some very extreme views on foreign policy, they weren't willing to go in on that. That was seen as extreme and out of, just like, completely out of touch. And Trump probably hears something like that. He's like, yeah, yeah, why don't we do that? And I don't think really thinks about either the history or the long-term consequences of that sort of thing. It's something that he can do today, and assuming it will pay off for him shortly. And if it doesn't, he just goes on to something else.
I
So,
also think that he has been people, particularly on the left, gave the Biden administration a lot of noise for going along with Netanyahu. And I think that, one of the things that's really bedeviled the Democratic Party in the last few years is, figuring out the Israel Gaza situation, figuring out, what the United States' relationship to Israel should be. But, even folks who are the most critical of how much Biden was willing to work with Netanyahu recognize that, like, this is something Biden wouldn't have done and refused to do. And that, the Democratic Party position for the last since Obama was that we're not going to go to war with Iran. We are willing to give the Iranian regime sanctions relief and access to the world market if they stopped their nuclear program. And then from everything we can learn, that worked. And then the Trump administration, the first term, tore it up, and then Iran started
mhm,
going back to. And so, I think the Israel has wanted to do this for a really long time because it is in Israel's understood self-interest to, have Iran both be poor and not have nuclear weapons, given, Iran's support for Hezbollah and Hamas. So, Trump gave in onto what the demands had been. And, I think a lot of leftists who thought that Biden did the wrong thing vis-a-vis Israel, and some of whom thought Trump would be better, I think have to grapple with the fact that, like, this is Israel getting literally everything that it wanted from the American government,
mhm,
which isn't what happened during the Biden administration, no matter what they were accused of. And I think that
right.
this is going to be a problem that bedevils the Democrats for a long time because, I think where Democratic voters are is different than the rest of the country, but where Democratic voters are is still very strongly pro-Israel, even if it's also pro-Palestinian and pro-peace.
Mhm. Um, there's two other things I wanted to follow up on. One is you had noted earlier in this conversation that the American public generally has sort of a, if not actually an anti-war stance, kind of an anti-interventionism stance, and that we usually don't want to get dragged into stuff. I'm curious, is that my impression is that's waxed and waned somewhat over the years. That, like, I think of, and I still remember pretty well the first Gulf War, in 1991, where George Bush Sr. was trying to build up this case over the course, over about half a year, this case for attacking Iraq. And as I recall, that was a wildly popular war, at least for a little while. And Bush was wildly popular after its conclusion, which was, it was a fairly brief war. It had very limited set of aims, but it was very popular. And of course, during the Cold War, the American people were pretty supportive of doing stuff to push back at the Soviet Union, even if not necessarily crazy about things like the Korean War and the Vietnam War. Um, is anti-interventionism mostly a recent thing? Is it weird that we kind of have two parties that aren't that into war right now? Or I'm trying to get a sense of how unique this
Yeah.
moment is.
So my understanding of the polling is that, and public opinion more generally, is that before World War II, that anti-interventionism was the default setting for American public opinion, right? That
That
we felt
what was?
protected by that anti-interventionism was sort of the default
Okay.
setting for American public opinion. That, we had these oceans that protected us, and that what was happening in Europe was not our problem. I think that the post World War II to up until Iraq War was probably the exception and not the rule. And I think that, like with a lot of things, people's understanding of the world got set during that bizarre period where, I think Americans were more open than we ever have been at other parts of our history to getting involved overseas. I think the Vietnam War challenged that to a strong degree, but as we saw in Iraq, didn't completely knock it out. I think that the Iraq War was only possible because the 9/11 attack on America made people feel like this wasn't a fight that we could hide from. I think the Bush administration was morally indefensible at turning an attack by Al Qaeda into a reason to go to war with Iraq. And I think, much smarter folks than us can have laid that case out really well. But I
Right.
think the fact remains that they were able to connect those things, and that people who in general would not have wanted American soldiers fighting in a foreign war felt like, okay, we didn't start this fight, they started this fight, we have to finish it. And of course, the transferring of enemies from Al Qaeda to Iraq was cynically done, and I think, you know, a sin that we're going to have to atone for a long time. But I think that is one of the differences in this war between, you know, if the conflict with Iran expands, is that there's no ability to point to and say they did this first, right? And you know, the neocons who have wanted the war with Iran for a long time, I think, will point to October 7th and the attacks by Hamas in Israel. But you know, I think that will be really hard for the average American to say, okay, yes, this is, they attacked us, so we are fighting back. I do think
Mm-hmm.
that, you know, the attack on Pearl Harbor, the attack on 9/11, those were the things that got Americans over the hump of the sort of default anti-interventionism into the more robust and muscular foreign policy that followed in those periods.
Mm. Oh, that makes sense.
That's my view of it. And you know,
Yeah.
smarter listeners who know their history better than I do, you know, may could certainly correct me. But you know, I think we're in a position here where, you know, most Americans don't want American soldiers dying in foreign soil. Now, whether that applies to American airplanes dropping really heavy bombs and flying away safely, I think that's a harder question to answer.
Mm. Right, right. I'll ask the traditionally soulless question that people like us ask is like, could this be the sort of thing that could affect U.S. elections? And I'll say, like, I'll just start off with the poli-sci view, and this is more based on 20th century elections than 21st century elections, is that there aren't that many issues that actually people will switch party, or not necessarily switch parties, but will move their votes around, and you know, punish or reward the party that's in power in the White House. One of them is the economy, whether it's expanding or contracting, and the other is whether we're in a sustained war where U.S. troops are dying.
Yeah.
And like that's actually really unpopular, and that has cost, you know, parties in power their significant votes and seats. I'm curious if you see something like this, at least at this stage, as extending into U.S. elections. Could this even be affecting the state elections that are happening this year? Could it be affecting the New York City election that's happening today? I'm curious how
Yeah.
far down you see this going.
I mean, I think it's too early to know for sure. Like, there's
Hmm.
certainly a world you could see where, you know, if this leads to a prolonged regime change war, yeah, absolutely. If it stays where it is, probably not. I do think it's worth remembering that the Biden slump in the polls started with the withdrawal from Afghanistan and never recovered. That I do think that the perception of international chaos is bad for an American president, that American voters want things to feel understandable and predictable. And so if voters see this as creating more chaos down the road, I think that's bad for the Trump administration. But I think the flip side is if voters see this as, you know, bringing an international order under control and flexing American might at very little cost to us and things getting better, you might see the Republicans benefit from it. You know,
Hmm.
I think that the lesson of the Biden administration is that, you know, taking international chaos can hurt American politics, and um, we need to be very alert to that. I think the flip side is harder to find a good example of voters rewarding less chaos in the international system. And again, we have no idea sitting here on Tuesday, the 24th, what that will do. I think that the war in Iran, I don't expect to have a huge impact on the New York elections, but I do think, you know, Israel and Gaza and Middle Eastern politics in general have had a major impact
Sure.
on those elections so far. You know, that I think a lot of the early support for Zoran Mamdani was driven by the fact that he was saying something different than the kind of Democratic Party establishment consensus on Israel and Gaza. And there's a deep hunger for that, particularly among more progressive urban voters, for somebody saying, like, hold up, what's happening here? We have a major problem with. And also, there's been some pushback on Mamdani from folks who have accused him of anti-Semitism because of foreign policy views. I think the New York City mayoral election has had more foreign policy content than any American municipal election than
Right.
I have ever seen. Yeah.
Well, do we think that covers it? Because I kind of want to. I want to ask you about you'd mentioned that you were not allowed to bake pastries for your wedding.
Yes, let's
I'm
talk about
guessing that was a good
yeah.
call, but like I'd love to know how it turned out.
It was a good call. My husband, early on was like, "You absolutely are not making our wedding cake. We have things that you need to be nice to people. You need to see all your friends." So we were really fortunate that Minnesota and Minneapolis has an incredible pastry chef named Diane Moa, who was a James Beard Award finalist this year for Best Chef Midwest. Was named by the New York Times one of America's 20 best bakers. She's an incredible Hmong American pastry chef who does beautiful things. So we ordered a selection of pastries from her. We had a coconut and pandan profiterole. We had a
Ooh.
Thai tea flavored profiterole. We had some mango and passion fruit tarts. We had a Chinese 5-spice chocolate cake. And then we had my personal favorite, which was a carrot cake with a Thai tea buttercream. It was incredible. We had
Okay,
a huge
wow.
variety of desserts. Yeah, it was amazing. We
Sound really good.
They were really good. I'll send you a
Yeah.
picture of Adam and I cutting one of the Thai tea cakes. The food was incredible. We had yeah, there's a whole array of desserts. Most people wisely got one of each and ate them. There were a few leftovers at the end of the night. We were giving away pastries, but one of my in-laws took all the savory food and had a potluck party a couple days later where we all ate the leftovers. And Adam's cousin and her partner got one of the entire Thai tea carrot cakes to go, and they skipped the potluck party and they stayed home and ate the cake themselves. So we are
Oh,
fighting with them.
shrewd,
I
shrewd move.
They had
Yeah.
to work, they had things to do, but everybody went to the potluck expecting to redo the desserts, and only the profiteroles were left. So yeah. But as I've told Adam, we have a great excuse now to go every year to Diane's place in Northeast Minneapolis and recreate that experience.
Wow, I really got to get there at some point soon. Okay.
Yeah, you come and visit. We'll take you there. It's incredible. Other than your rosemary bread, what have you been making lately?
I made another koinaman recently as a callback to a previous
Oh,
episode. It's that very labor intensive laminated dough thing, makes a giant like 14-inch diameter disc of basically bread and butter and sugar, and it's fantastic. But and I made some Pride cookies recently in celebration of Pride Month. And those actually came out really well. I'll post a photo of them on the on our Substack.
excellent.
So I think that's about it. Thank you for a great discussion. I think this is really helpful. Hopefully, you listeners will find it helpful in whatever environment you're listening to this in a day or two from now. But we shall see.
Um, yeah, absolutely. I think the other thing we'll see is, how much this obscures the discussion around the big beautiful bill or whatever you want to call it that they're trying to move through Congress right now. So, hopefully we'll learn a lot more about all of that in the days to come.
Quite possibly. Okay. Thanks so much, John. And thank you all for listening.
All right. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Power and Flour. This episode was produced by Eli Maskett. We encourage you to follow and rate this podcast wherever you listen to it. Watch for new episodes at the end of each week.